So welcome everyone as you come into this event. We're going to give it about a minute or so, and then we're going to get going. My name is Andrew Munson. Some of you know me. I know some of you. Happy to see some folks I know here. And we're here with Jana Larson and Justin St. Germain tonight. So we're really happy to have this conversation. Just I guess like a housekeeping note, you're welcome to turn on the video. There's no obligation to turn on video. Please do leave your audio off unless we're asking a question toward the end. My preference would be to have the questions in the chat as kind of starting point so we can get to some of them. But like if we want to get things going, then you're welcome to turn on to ask your question. Mostly kind of like a bandwidth situation. So I guess we're going. One other thing to note is this is being recorded. So we're going to have the video embedded on the blog later on in Essay Daily. If you want to revisit this lovely conversation, as I think many of us might, and hopefully we're going to try to do something with it later in which we also can transcribe and continue the conversation and then publish the conversation on essaydaily.org. So if you don't know, Essay Daily, which is the website that's sponsoring this conversation, we started doing these salons in part. It's really a pandemic thing, this kind of feeling of everyone being in their own little square of the world and missing out on some of the conversations that we really felt was our raison d'etre that we started the whole website for. We wanted people to be together to talk about stuff. So this is, I think, the 6th or 7th of these and the first of our fall series. We'll have a few more to tell you about as we get into fall, but thank you all for coming to this. We're really happy to have you here. So the format of this will be, I'm going to briefly introduce Jana Larson and Justin St. Germain. And I'm going to ask them each to read for about 5 minutes from their new books, which are here, Real Bay, which love both these. Come on, really? It's not giving me, there we go. A little bit of Justin's there. If you don't know these books, these are both really wonderful books that came out last spring. And they're ones I'm really attached to and really excited reading and rereading and thinking about. And I'm really looking forward to teaching and talking with both Jana and Justin here tonight. So any point, you're welcome to throw comments and questions in the chat. And we'll try to get to some of those as we talk after the readings. So first, I'm going to grab, I have Justin, there we go. I have Justin's bio here, but I do not seem to have Jana's. Jana, where are you at these days? You are in Colorado now, but you're on the way back to Minneapolis. Are you teaching right now?
No, actually, I'm an environmental educator at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And right now I'm in Basalt, Colorado, which is near Aspen.
Awesome. And this is Jana's first book, came out during the pandemic. Always unfortunate to have a first book come out during the pandemic, especially in January of 2021, as we were talking about beforehand, which was a busy month where people had a lot of things to pay attention to. But it's a really wonderful book. This is one that I didn't know Jana's work at all. And it was sent to me from Coffee House. It's like, oh, maybe you want to take a look at this. And I read it and I was like, holy shit. Like, this is a crazy book. Like it does all the stuff that I want in a book of essays. Like it's wild. It's not really about what it professes to be about. It's got all these tangents that are going everywhere. It does formal stuff. So really hyped to hear you read and to talk about this. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah. So thanks, Ander. I'm really excited to be here and talk to Ander and Justin about crime. And so my first book, Real Bay, it's purportedly, as Ander says, about Takako Kunishi, who was a Japanese woman who flew from Tokyo to Minnesota to ostensibly search for the ransom money that Steve Buscemi buried at the end of the movie Fargo. And I was in graduate school at the time. I read this article in the newspaper about her, and I decided to make a film. And so the book sort of charts my journey to understand Takako's story. And I'm going to read from page 19 of the book, just as I'm arriving in or I've arrived in Minneapolis and I'm taking a bus to Bismarck, North Dakota, retracing Takako's journey. So Bismarck, North Dakota is a 6-hour drive from Minneapolis, but it takes about 10 hours by bus. You sit toward the back next to an old man who sleeps with his mouth hanging open and an older woman with a red checkered shirt and dyed black hair and curlers. She reads a coupon circular like it's a novel. Just in front of you, 3 Amish brothers talk among themselves in a thick Germanic language. You eavesdrop and try to figure out what they're saying. It sounds biblical at first, but occasionally they say things in English like solid oak door, and you second guess that theory. You settle in, take out your video camera, and start to film the landscape going by outside the window. You try to imagine you are Takako, that you've watched the movie Fargo, believe it's a true story, believe there's a suitcase full of money buried somewhere on this road, and believe you can find it. Fargo is a Black comedy by Joel and Ethan Coen. It tells the story of a car salesman named Jerry Lundegaard who hires 2 thugs to kidnap his wife so he can buy a parking lot with the ransom money from his rich father-in-law. It's a harebrained scheme that goes wrong in every way. Most pertinently for Takako's story, one of the hired kidnappers, played by Steve Buscemi, buries a suitcase containing nearly $1 million in a snowbank on the side of the road, and then he winds up dead. That wouldn't mean much if the Coen brothers hadn't claimed that Fargo was a true story. At the request of the survivors, the names have been changed. Out of respect for the dead, the rest has been told exactly as it occurred. You can see this quote behind Ander. After the film came out, in interviews and publicity, the Coen brothers maintained that the film was definitely true, all true. They managed to create a fair amount of confusion with their claims. An article published in the Brainerd Dispatch on February 11th, 1997, reports that both the Brainerd Police Department and the newspaper received multiple phone calls and letters after Fargo came out, asking for more information about the case. Even the cast of the movie was led to believe Fargo was a true story. William H. Macy, upon hearing that the events of the film weren't actually true, said, "What? You can't do that." So if Takako watched Fargo and thought it was based on fact, she wasn't the only one. It would have made sense for her to take the geography represented in the movie at face value and to think the ransom money was still buried out there somewhere. Fargo takes place primarily in Minnesota near the towns of Brainerd. Brainerd and Minneapolis, with an opening scene in Fargo, North Dakota, and a final scene in Bismarck. The bus you're on, the one that Takako would have taken, goes from Minneapolis to Brainerd to Fargo on its way to Bismarck. It's like a tour of the movie locations. You settle back expecting to see the landscapes from the film, endless, flat, white, empty. But that's not what happens as the bus pulls out of Minneapolis. Instead, traveling northwest on the highway, you pass car dealerships, shopping malls, billboards, and housing developments. You set your camera down and lean your head against the glass, watching the moisture from your breath condense and freeze in an oblong circular patch. It will be several hours before you get to Brainerd. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask Justin to read here and then we'll talk. Justin St. Germain, author of the book-length essay, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which is part of IG Publishing's Bookmark series. And I really like this series, as well as one that Fiction Advocate was doing. The sort of books about writing back to books, which was our first one of these Salon events that we did, I think almost exactly like a year ago. It was maybe October of last fall. And there's something really fascinating about, which also happens in Jana's book, where we sort of watch Jana watching Fargo and we can watch Fargo with her. But same with Justin's, that we read In Cold Blood while Justin is reading In Cold Blood and kind of giving us the backstory of it. And so you see the mind sort of interrupting and kind of engaging and undercutting this other text that many of us are aware of, possibly the most famous text of creative nonfiction. And so it's a really great book. And if you haven't read it, you should totally check it out. And maybe also read In Cold Blood if you haven't read that. His first book, the memoir Son of a Gun, won the Barnes & Noble Discover Award and was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and is talked about in pretty significant depth in this book too. St. Germain is an alum of the MFA program where I teach at U of A. And he's been like a great contributor and collaborator in a number of ways. Maybe most interestingly, he co-hosts I'll Find Myself When I'm Dead, this podcast about the literary essay, which if you are here, I'll put a link of it in the chat. If you are here, you will be interested in this podcast. It's a great podcast. Justin and Elena Passarello co-host this. And it's really a blast to hear them talking about essays and then a bunch of other random stuff. And he also, like Elena, he teaches at Oregon State University and lives in Oregon. So Justin, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me. Thanks for reading the books and setting this up. I appreciate it. And I was really happy. I was just saying this before everybody got here, but it was nice to be able to read Jana's book and just be able to have this conversation. I think it probably would have taken me longer to get to it otherwise. So I'm just going to read a couple pages. I'm really more excited about the conversation. I think there are a lot of ways in which I think the two books, it's just really interesting to me to read Jana's book and to think that we're two people who had never met each other, who were working on these projects far away from each other, but like mining some of the same veins, I think. And I've found that really fascinating. So I'm just going to read a couple pages from, it's the fourth part of the book. So like In Cold Blood, which is intentional, it has four sections. And some other things about it are kind of modeled after In Cold Blood. But one of them is that in the fourth section, it kind of transitions from a story, more or less, into much more of like an argument or an analytical kind of section. And in Cold Blood, it's about capital punishment. In this book, it's about true crime. So basically, it traces my relationship with In Cold Blood from the first time I read it at Arizona during grad school in a class with a very beloved professor of mine. And then transitions to reading it again while I was working on my first book, which is a crime book in some ways. It's about my mother's murder. And then talks about a trip to Holcomb I took with my then girlfriend, now wife, and then which is where In Cold Blood is set. And then this fourth section takes place, like actually this class I'm talking about is the last class I taught. At the end of this class for the finals, we got shut down for the pandemic. So this is, this takes place like last March-ish, February maybe. Before we start discussing, and the classes, I had started teaching a true crime class once like in order to try to like have more students, undergraduates interested in nonfiction. So this is the second time teaching this true crime class. Before we start discussing In Cold Blood, I give the class some context. First, the backstory, Capote's old chestnut about finding the newspaper article and having a revelation. After that, I tell them the real story, how Capote went to Kansas to write an article, that Harper Lee went with him, and so on. I ask if anybody has read In Cold Blood before. Nobody has, but they all know To Kill a Mockingbird. So I tell them Dill was based on Capote and talk a bit about his early career, fame, and personality. I show a brief clip of him being interviewed so they can hear his infamous voice, see his charm at work, and understand how he might have had a hard time in Holcomb, at least at first. The clip is from the Maysles Brothers documentary, A Visit with Truman Capote. I should say here, it has a few different titles. So if you find a Maysles Brother documentary that's about Capote, that's the one. Released early in 1966, right as In Cold Blood was taking over the world. In class, I only show the first few minutes to give a sense of the man behind the book before we move on to the opening pages, how Capote sets the stage. His focus on community and tragedy, the silos rising like Greek temples, and the townspeople as a chorus, and so on. The alternating portrayals of the clutters and their killers, the book's starkly different sympathies. I try to avoid the topic of truth, at least at first, but my students aren't the readers of Capote's era. Like all generations' theories about the next, mine are anecdotal, skewed by nostalgia, and punitive, projections of my own atavistic fears of death and irrelevance. But in the last few years, as my classes have transitioned from late millennials, more or less my own generation, to a distinct new one, post-millennials, Gen Z, whatever, I've noticed a shift in my students' attitudes about truth. It's not just them. American ideas of truth have changed since Capote went to Kansas. He began in cold blood during the Eisenhower era of prosperous post-war conservatism, an environment his portrayal of the Clutters was probably meant to critique. But in the years Capote spent writing the book, he saw his friend John F. Kennedy elected president, ushering in a new and turbulent era of lies and conspiracies. The Bay of Pigs, JFK's assassination, the country blundering deeper into war in Vietnam. By the time In Cold Blood was released, the 60s were roiling America's belief system, and the idea of a shared and definite truth has taken a beating ever since. The generation before mine remembers My Lai, Watergate. We had Iran-Contra, the Clinton impeachment, 9/11. My current students were born during our endless, factless war in Iraq and grew up with social media, the death blow for any notion of collective truth, and smartphones, the black mirrors of the present. They've been bombarded by spun facts, equivocations, and outright lies for their entire lives. My class takes place in 2020, 4 years into the Trump administration, a moment when truth itself is a partisan issue and arguably less relevant than ever before. I've spent the last few years standing in front of rooms of young adults discussing the concept of truth. They don't seem to care all that much about it or believe that it exists, and it's hard to blame them. We don't even talk much about truth in class. We talk about truth claims, the ways a text convinces you to believe it. On the first day of discussing In Cold Blood, when I tell the class Capote claimed every word of it was true, somebody asks what that even means. I don't know the answer, but if we had time, I'd show the rest of A Visit with Truman Capote as a way of trying to find one. The documentary is a case study in true portrayals, a hall of mirrors, the best known film documentarians of their era, making a movie about its best known nonfiction writer, as he's interviewed by a prominent reporter for a major national magazine, everybody creating their own version of the truth. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. And so maybe that's a good place for us to start. I mean, both of these books have like different relationships with truth. There is, I don't have the sense reading Justin's book that any of it is necessarily being fictionalized, but because it seems like a fairly, well, relatively straightforward adventure into a kind of like documentary trip into thinking about the questions. But that's not the case with Jana's. I mean, in Real Bay, either for long chunks, it is unclear to me what exactly we're reading. If it's a piece of fiction, is it a piece of nonfiction, who the relationship is of, you know, the sort of this filmmaker who shows up in these script scenes. I think I kind of start to, you know, we understand, I think that it is like the eye, to the degree that the eye is a true thing. I don't even know if the eye is a true thing exactly. I mean, the eye is a character in both these books that we play. And I guess I would wonder maybe if each of you would be up for talking a little bit about your relationship, the relationship that you have with apparent truth in the book, because they both, I guess, like they both create a sense of tension, which Justin was just kind of speaking to directly. And the book becomes also, Justin's becomes like a lot about what exactly true means with regard to like Capote's In Cold Blood, because there's a lot of that, you know, it's called a nonfiction novel, right? A lot of that is substantially fictionalized. It's been pretty well documented. And if you don't know that story, I mean, Justin's book is a great kind of introduction to that. So maybe just ask each of you to talk a little bit about, like, do you care about truth? Like the degree to which like the reader, I guess, like comes in having a feeling about truth, or are you trying to make a claim on it? This is not like a question that I even intended to ask. So I don't know if you have prepared something about this, but I would love to hear you talk about truth. I figure we might as well go big to start with.
You want to take that one, Jana, or you want me to go first?
Sure, I'll try to take that one. The parts of the book that are true, I mean, most of the book is true in some sense, right? Like there are screenplays where there are scenes taken from my own life turned into a screenplay where I'm a character, but they actually happened. So, and then there's a lot of information about Takako that is like from a police report or from interviews. So there's a lot of sort of different ways of treating, true material. But it's sort of asking the whole book is sort of asking, what is our relationship to stories? How do we create stories about things that actually happened? And once there's a story, is it true any longer? I think in some ways this is a memoir, but I'm really looking at one very particular part of my life to try and understand how it intersects with Takako's life. And I'm understanding Takako's character and what I think might have been true for her through the lens of my own story. But of course, in the end, I'm a writer crafting a story. And the way that I'm kind of holding myself and Takako and all these other people in the book up as characters is in a way calling attention to this, to the fact that we are characters in a story, and thus always not quite true, because like you said, does the I really exist? It's always this thing that we're right, we all know memory is just a constant reconstruction and rewriting of events. So I guess I'm sort of like peeling or painting and peeling away all these layers of ways of telling stories about what actually happened. I don't know if that's an answer, but that's what I got.
I think that question Jana just said, once, I could give you believe me, a really long-winded answer, but I think that question of sorry, I'm paraphrasing, once there's a story, is it true any longer, is a pretty good tagline for my book as well, because I think that's the interesting thing when you try to write something true. And I was kind of responding a lot to my own first book as well as to In Cold Blood, but there's this idea among like a mass readership where it's like, I feel like, and I'm generalizing, but I feel like people want things to be true in the verifiable sense, where you, like you were saying, you can check the police, you're using sources, you're consulting sources, etc. But that's about as far as it goes, because they also still want it to be entertaining, and they want it to have a story. And like most I think readers are, on some spectrum of like frustrated with storyless nonfiction. And so I don't think a lot of people appreciate the degrees to which those two things are completely at odds with each other. That you can have a true thing or you can have a story. And the minute you start to make it into a story, you have to start making decisions that make it less true. And I think like my book's kind of about Capote doing that, but it's not to absolve myself from doing it. I think, in a lot of ways I do things, I can't even get into all the stuff he changes, but he makes up the ending, for example, like the ending of In Cold Blood. And this is not like a well-kept secret. It's completely fictionalized. He admitted it later. The whole ending scene, it did not happen. And so, that's a huge change in my mind, but not a lot of people at the time cared about it. Like I poured through all the criticism and nobody really cared much about issues of truth at the time. An Esquire reporter went to Kansas 6 months later after it got published and kind of debunked large portions of the book, and nobody cared. It remained a bestseller. It remained, like, the movie came out soon after. It was this sensation. And so I guess, yeah, that idea of like the story, narrativizing something, and truth, I think are at odds. And you mentioned like the narrator. My book, this book has a first person narrative, and that by itself is such a fiction. It's such a made up. The person is not real. People assume it's me, but it's, even if to the degree that it is an authentic me, it's the me that existed at a point in time, and people change. And I think like I just saw, my wife and I, and actually Elena and David of March Xmas fame, just saw that Bourdain documentary that was all such a controversy. And I was so struck by the fact that all these people were upset about the fact that they used AI for voiceover to generate like a voiceover he didn't say. But nobody seemed to discuss the fact that like having a voiceover at all is a total fiction. It's a total construction. And like the issue everybody seemed to have was that the voiceover was not actually the human voice, but like the existence of a voiceover is a layer of fiction. And I mean, I think that those kinds of like narrow and like, I get frustrated by conversations of truth because they tend to be kind of narrow and kind of like unsophisticated in that way. But I think Jana's point is really the key of it, is distills it. There's like, you can make it a story or you can make it true.
I mean, that kind of gets at one of the interesting things that, or one of the tensions I'm really drawn to with both of your books, which is the interaction between the sort of, there's a central narrative, both road trips. I guess there's like kind of a quest that both of you are on in these books, which is a narrative quest, to try to like understand something about the subject that you're going to. And that provides certainly like the forward motion of the book, but that's not really what the book's about. I mean, both books are much more interested in all this other stuff, the kind of side quests. Like I've really, the more I play games, the more I think about pieces of text as like main quests and side quests, and kind of like how much main quest do you need to like get people to the side quests? How satisfying can a side quest be? Because all the like the sort of thinky stuff is on the side, all of the weird formal stuff is on the side. And I guess like from like a practical craft standpoint, I would love to hear you talk about managing like that intense draw that by having a story automatically builds into the book versus your desire to do asides.
Okay, I can go first this time if you want. Take the, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true. I think it is, I do think I tried to create a narrative through line that also is not, even to me, like really the center of the book. I don't know exactly why. I mean, I think in a lot of ways I didn't have the same pressures for this book. It's with a small press. They gave me a lot of freedom. And I kind of wrote it thinking, honestly, I like this time around, I really tried to write it for people like the people in this room. I tried to write it for practitioners, for, you know what I mean? That was like a real luxury, but I kind of knew, I didn't expect this book to be like a bestseller. It wasn't going to be a commercial success, right? So I kind of was freed from a lot of the stuff that comes along with that pressure. And it was really nice but I still feel this pressure to have a story just in case. And I think a lot of it honestly is like, I mean, I grew up working class. Like I want people, it's important to me that people that I know who are not like, don't have MFAs can pick up my book. Like people I know from like Tombstone, you know what I mean? People who don't read a lot of books in a year can pick up my book and get something out of it. So that was a really hard thing with this book. Like I feel that way about all my work, but it was hard with this book because I was like, how do I write this kind of inside baseball thing that's still a little bit more approachable? And I don't know that it's a good solution, but the only solution I had for that was to still kind of create some sort of narrative through line, because I do think maybe it helps. But it's not what I think it's about. I think it's about portrayal. I think it's about nonfiction portrayal, really, and specifically portrayal of the dead. But I also did rip off Capote a little bit, because really What in Cold Blood, and that happened more organically, but it starts off as the story of a murder and it becomes an argument against capital punishment. And I felt like in some ways my book started off as like an argument against Capote and became an argument about an entire genre and like about like why people want what they want from like crime media and murder media specifically.
Yeah, it's such a great book, Justin. Me too. I really care about a narrative, like having a driving through line. I think, I was about to say the only kind of writing I've ever studied is screenwriting, but that's not actually true. I have an MFA in creative writing too. But like sort of my foundation of studying writing was the screenplay, which is really like a short story or a poem. Like there's not much narrative there, but it's got to be pretty taut. And So, and the sort of through line is my own obsession to understand Takako's obsession. And I feel like emotionally that sort of allows me to go off on all of these obsessive tangents. They sort of, even though they are sort of what sidebars, or I can't remember what you called them, Ander, but they're still sort of emotionally tied to the obsession of the narrator to understand something. And so I don't know, I was thinking about this question, and I sort of feel in a way like maybe an essay is a bit like a film, in that if you have a fairly simple narrative backbone, perhaps that's what creates the space to go off on these tangents, but they still need to be imperative. Or it feels to me, I don't know, this is just my theory thinking about this, but it still needs to feel imperative to the story, and it still needs to fit into that story, because there was so much more material, as you can imagine. I mean, it really was not just an invented obsession, but a real obsession. And, you know, my book could have been 700 pages long or something if I had gone off on every tangent that I wanted to. But, you know, just I had to sort of pare a lot of it away in order for it to, you know, be readable.
I mean, could you is there like an example of, I don't know, what, like a bit that you like, I don't know, a research track or some side quest that you're like, okay, how, like, does this support itself? Or like, I got to pull this back? Or were you, I mean, did you do that like in editing, or were you doing that in composing? You're like, oh no, I got to stay on target. Or
Oh,
like, I guess there
no.
are like rules like that you have where like you're balancing how well like a tangent kind of works.
It's all in editing. I mean, I think the way I wrote the book is not a good way to write a book, which is that I wrote like probably 800 pages. And then I spent a whole summer like going through those and just highlighting anything that interested me out of that 800 pages. And then I cut those things apart, and basically physically around my apartment, cut things apart and edited it like a film. So it was almost like I had all this footage that I needed to figure out how to fit together. And so there was a lot from the police report that I didn't make it in. There were I wrote about a lot of films that you know needed to be cut. There were a lot of you know, entries about sort of my mind state. I mean, because this is like not including all the journals that I kept during this time, you know. So there's a few snippets of that, but it just didn't fit. Like it sometimes the voice was wrong, or sometimes it was like I'd just been away from the story for too long, and it just didn't fit. I guess it was intuitive editing. No rules.
I'm kind of hoping like there's like a shot of you, like there always is in like whatever the police procedurals, with like the big bulletin board with all the stuff and like the strings, as you're sort of like obsessively like trying to find like what's in there or not. Like, I would love to see like a visual representation. I love when people cut stuff up like that, because it just feels also like such like it's like a non-writing thing. It's like you're bringing like another technique from a whole other craft or art form into it. Like it's more like a, you know, like a cutting in the editing room, which you
Yeah.
can, I mean, that tracks a lot for me. Justin, did you find yourself having to like pare stuff back in certain places?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. Well, first I want to say something about Jana's book that I really like also enjoy and maybe hasn't been said yet, which is like, I'm so interested in that idea of, I was thinking so much about that, is like somebody who has a background in screenwriting coming to an essay, what I thought of as an essay. It calls itself an essay, right? A book length essay. It's a form I love. And I hadn't really seen that particular, you know, I've seen a lot of poets come over to the essay. It's a very like open genre. It's one of the things I love about it, but I hadn't seen the screenwriter book-length essay, and I really, really dug it in a lot of different ways, and a lot of the ways you're talking about. But one of the things that's really, I think, great about it is like, not only do you kind of create a narrative, but like you're so good with, I think maybe because of that background, but you're just like really good with image and the visual. Like when I remember your book, because, you know, I read it about a month and a half ago, maybe, but I remember so many of those images, like that moment in your, you know, where you're trying to like you're trying to create that image, and like the snow machine is all screwed up and like the interns are messing up, like it just, it goes off the rails, or like that idea of disappearing into white that comes back is just like really beautifully done, I think. And it makes it really engaging on like this other level that's really cool. And I wonder how much of that is because of screenplay, or maybe it's just like a natural thing. No, for me, I mean, my answer is pretty short for my own book. I was really lucky. They were very kind, but I just pitched like this book. I knew the series, and because Aaron Birch had come, who had written the one on the Stephen King's The Body, had come to OSU a while back. I think Elena actually invited him here, and I talked to him about it. And it was just when it was coming out, we had a screening of Stand By Me, and talked about it and stuff. It was great. So I just cold pitched it, and they were like, yeah, how much time do you need? And, you know, like writer who hasn't started a project, I was like, I don't know, like a year. Or no, I said 9 months, and they were like, maybe take a year. And I was like, okay. And I just had to write it pretty fast, as it turned out. So I didn't have a lot of time to go back. And my first book was exactly what Janice talking about: write 120,000 words, cut out 50. And exactly the same way, like this seems interesting and this doesn't, and a lot of it didn't. So that was kind of, but this one I did revise it, but I did a lot of planning ahead of time to try to keep it contained.
I mean, it strikes me that both of these books are kind of in response to like failures of various sorts. Like there's like this whole narrative of Jana, in, you know, being told that like she doesn't know what a film is, as she's like pitching all these ideas for films. And then all, like, you know, the fancy film people are all just kind of shitting on these ideas, but the things that she's like drawn to are like these images, like these ideas. And I don't know if the eye misunderstands film, or if these people that think they understand film are misunderstanding like film and like what you're imagining. So like I read the book as being like, it's like a failed film that became this other thing. And in a way, like I feel the same is the case with Justin's. It's like a function of like this, there's so much thinking about like the failed version of Son of a Gun that you had written before, and your attempts to sort of find your way into it, and then, you know, the process of publishing that, and then its pleasures and disappointments. And I wonder if you could talk a little more about failure, as a, maybe not as a starting point necessarily, but how it works, because like it's humbling in a really useful way in both books, and it makes us root for both of you as narrators.
Is it my turn to go first? I'm sorry, I got mixed up. I'm just gonna, if that's okay, Jen, I'm just gonna go. Okay, I don't mean to cut you off. Yeah, no, that's, I think, like in some ways, I think this book is like, it's not literary analysis. I've been really interested in the way people would describe it, like once it came out, because it doesn't have any tags. And that's one of the things I loved about the Bookmark series, is they don't label it. It doesn't say, it's not called a memoir. It's not called anything. And I thought of it as a book-length essay, but very few people have described it. And I mean, you know, maybe that's a niche interest. But anyway, in a lot of ways, I feel like it came out of like a failed experiment at being an actual literary critic. Like I wrote the first one large section of this first as a graduate school paper in a lit class, where I was really trying to analyze like, what is Capote doing, and like trying to put it in context. And then I tried to kind of layer in some, in this book, there's a lot of stuff about like not a lot, but there's some documentary theory, which made Jana sort of my nightmare reader, where I'm like, oh no, I didn't think anybody who actually knew this stuff would ever read this book. Because it was like, it's like taking the most obvious two, you know what I mean? If you order the anthology that's like theorizing documentary, it's like the first two people. And so it was kind of like I don't have the chops to do like a real critical book. And I have a lot of friends who do, so I know that I don't, but I wanted to kind of incorporate some of that. So in some ways, it's formally, I think it's a failure in multiple ways. It's like not really a story. It's not really a critical book. And it's not really an argument, but I that's what I love about like the essay is that you can try to do all these things at once and hope that at least you can, through implication, get some of that done. And yeah, I mean, I did think a lot of it's about contrasting Capote's book as like, I mean, in Cold Blood, I make this argument in the book based on a lot of research, but like, I didn't know this when I first read it. I don't think a lot of people who read it now understand, frankly, but like, it's probably the most successful nonfiction book of all time. Commercially successful in a sense of like, I mean, it's hard to overestimate how successful that book was. It made Capote a millionaire before it came out. And so, you know, comparing that to my book, which I felt like like I was thinking about it more artistically as a writer, I do still feel, I mean, I don't think it's perfect, but I feel pretty good about it, my first one. But then like commercially, it was considered a failure. I mean, it was a failure. It didn't sell. And so trying to kind of like think about that and like, what does that say anything? And in the end, I don't know that it does, but like about like wondering why, you know what I mean? What is it that like an audience wants? And there's a lot of factors, of course, publicity and all that, but like also what is it that an audience wants out of a story about murder? And what was I not providing? Like, and how was that related? So I guess that's how I would think of it in terms of like failure.
Yeah, I was also really moved, Justin, by your reflections on the ways that your first book sort of, I mean, I think in one place you say something like, what an act of hubris to, this is terrible. I don't think it's an exact quote, so forgive me, but it's something like, what an act of hubris to preserve my own version of the dead. I had done to my mother exactly what Capote had done to the Clutters. And that sort of, sorry, now I'm talking about, I'm just like, I want to talk about your book, but I don't know, there was something like really this sort of moving examination of your first book and what it had succeeded in doing, and like sort of what you feared it had done, and ways that it was inadequate, that I felt made your essay so much more than just an academic essay. That was the part that really drew me in and made me really engaged in your argument and your process of asking questions. And I was, and I guess, you know, it was sort of what stymied, I mean, the reason why maybe it was so hard to make this film about Takako was something similar, this sort of feeling that I had that her story, I mean, and maybe it was a little bit nuts too, but it was this feeling that it, like, her story was very complex, and like anyone's story is very complex and difficult to pin down, and there was this fear that I mean, how do you make a film like that, right? And so there's like all these attempts at making films or ideas of films that, you know, I sort of paint my film professors at the time as there's sort of like this chorus in the background of like, no, not that, no, not that, which I hope is humorous, but they are kind of, I mean, any attempt is going to fail, and I think that failure is interesting in a sense. It's like this, it's a failure, but it's also a refusal to simplify something, because how do you what right do you have to represent someone who can't speak for themselves in some reductive way, which I think is another great quote from your book, that something about every portrayal of someone else is necessarily reductive. Anyway, I feel like I've just gone off some other area, but yeah, the failure. I do think failure is always more interesting than success. I like stories about failure. I don't really care about people who have succeeded. So maybe that's why it's a good story. I mean, or a story that I was drawn to tell.
Yeah, like there's, and I'm going to draw this back just to something from the chat before. So My Winnipeg, which I think you should watch. Jana, I don't know if you've watched My Winnipeg. I mean, you clearly know a lot more about film than I do. But it's one of the Guy Madden movies. And I really didn't like him when I first started watching his movies. They just seemed really, I don't know, like overwrought and like a little too cute. But then I watched My Winnipeg, and it's a movie about Winnipeg, which is where he's from. I guess it's true. Like, I don't really know. It's purported as a documentary, but it has like obviously bullshit things in it. And it tells all these like kind of key stories from Winnipeg history about like when all the horses were frozen to the ice, which I'm like, that doesn't seem like it could be true. Like, I don't know. But like one of the things that he does in that book is he hires actors to stage moments of like personal and family and romantic failure of his own, to like reenact them, which is just like a really intense and weird both ways. It kind of creates this, it externalizes the I, like that past I, because now the I is being portrayed by these actors. But then it's also kind of creating this kind of documentary slash fake documentary about the place. And I found it extremely compelling, and also kind of the key to the rest of his work, which then opened up this thing he was doing with artifice elsewhere in his stuff. And now I think he's great. And I just had the wrong introduction, I think, to him. And it's like a thing that fails, but like it succeeds in kind of casting its spell, even as it sort of falls apart. And the way it falls apart is fascinating. And the same way that like, I think that, you know, I mean, your films or your ideas for films, this quest to make the film about Takako falls apart. I mean, and just like as an aside, have any of your film professors who show up in here, have they like seen the book? Do they like, I sort of would love to see, I don't know how they feel they were portrayed, or the degree to which, I don't know, are they exaggerated these conversations? Like they feel like they are, but it's also kind of to make you more of a dork in a certain way, which is always a good lie to tell if you're going to tell lies. Like you can exaggerate and make yourself seem like a fool. You just can't go the James Fry way and make yourself seem like a badass.
Yeah. I don't know if any of the film professors in the book have seen the book. I would guess not. And you know, the portrayal is true, all true. So yeah, I think obviously it's like a condensed and kind of caricatured version of the film professors. They're much more complicated people than the way that they're portrayed, and everybody's names are changed to protect the innocent.
I mean, I can see that being an easier trade-off to make versus like writing Takako. Like this woman who's kind of unknown and left very little. And there's all these barriers, right, between like your ability to understand what her life may have been like and what drove her to do what she did, and all the stories that the Minnesotans tell themselves and the filmmakers tell themselves about her motivations. And I guess I'm wondering, I guess I am wondering about the question of like portraying other people. And it feels like both of these answers in both books feel like the solution is to bring in more artifice and more kind of like framing of the question, thinking about the problems in doing so. Is that an apt read? It's fine if it's not. I totally could be full of shit too.
I can maybe, I mean, one thing I thought was interesting about this time around. So the first book I wrote, I didn't ask anybody for any permission. I didn't let anybody read it. I was like, look, this is a reckoning. Like, if you don't like it, I don't care. And, you know, I was like young, and I think maybe that was a little excessive in some ways. So it wound up like kind of, yeah, it's very Tombstone. Hell's coming with me. But it was kind of like, you know, it wound up having a lot of consequences. Like, and that's one of the things I talk to a lot about my students is like, you know, don't minimize your real life consequences of something you write, because, you know, it basically alienated my dad. I mean, we didn't have a good relationship anyway, but I basically have no relationship with my dad now, and it's because of the book. I talk a little bit about that, but like, and this time around, and I don't actually know exactly why, but like the two people that are really prominently portrayed in it are my grad school literature professor, Charlie, and my now wife, Bonnie. And I asked them both, I let them both read their sections and let them approve it beforehand. I gave them veto power. I was like, if you want anything changed, go ahead, tell me, and I'll do it. And they were, so I changed the things they wanted changed. There wasn't much. But then there was the question of permission, literal permissions for Capote, because Capote's estate is like legendarily litigious. They love to sue people. They have a lot of money, and they're very defensive of his work. And I quote his work a lot. And, you know, technically I could have asked, I think it's all fair use. I continue to think it's all fair use. I did a lot of like copyright reading to try to verify that I could have a case if it worst came to worst. But in the end, I didn't even ask, because he didn't ask. He didn't ask anybody. He didn't ask a whole town to portray them for the rest of eternity. And so I just didn't care. And I felt like there was some weird ethical thing underneath those decisions that I didn't totally understand and still don't understand. But I think I learned a lot about the consequences of portrayal from like my first book and from reading In Cold Blood, and did think about that a little bit in the later parts. And I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think I see like my approach to nonfiction portrayal kind of evolving the more I do it.
Just to, I totally agree, Justin. And I mean, it was my story that I was telling mostly, and I think that's fairly clear in the way that it's written, not claiming that to be telling anyone else's story but my own in some ways. But reading the book, knowing that it was going to be published, like there was an edit where I went through and I really asked myself, is this a portrayal that I want to be responsible for? It's kind of like how I was asking. And because I don't want to be the one who's unkind, or I don't want to be unkind to someone or viewed as unkind. I didn't see any benefit to, I mean, so there was an edit where I really asked, because you are responsible what you put out into the world. And, you know, if you're putting it out, is it necessary? Is it necessary to the story? Does it help tell the story, or can it be omitted because it might be hurtful to someone? And so, yeah, I do think that it's something to be really aware of. I don't think you cannot, when you're about to publish a book, I don't see how you cannot be aware that, yeah, there's no taking it back. So, but yeah, I think part of, and so I'm sorry to get back to your question, Ander, it's sort of like, yeah, one way that I've thought about putting a portrayal of someone into the world is making it very clear that it's my story, it's my perception, and perception is fraught. It's not objective, sort of. So, yeah.
I mean, it's your story, but it's also your story. Like that story quality of it is, I think, really important, and something that does, I mean, I don't know if to what degree that like insulates us from responsibility And I like that moment where you're reading it. Like I remember like when my first book came out, like I was looking at one and it was like the last copy of it. I'm like, oh, maybe I should change that guy's name. Like it was literally my geometry teacher. And I'm like, I just didn't even fucking change his name. I'm gonna change his name. And I changed the name of my like cocaine sniffing cousin because I'm like, maybe you should change his name too. There's a lot of real shit in there. But like that moment, we're like, oh yeah, okay. And you're the only one that can kind of make that decision unless you have an editor that really, or is like, a legal team at the, at the press that is trying to get you to think a little more critically about some of those. So I would love to see also just like the notes from that edit. Here's what I dialed back from, I don't know, that guy I met in Brainerd or whatever. Because Minnesotans, as you know, are also very conscious of the way that they're portrayed in Fargo. They hate that movie so much. And I love that movie so much. And I have a lot of Minnesota relatives. And I remember when that came out, they were just all, they're like, oh, we don't sound like that. I'm like, oh my God, you 100% do. And they're telling me like, you betcha, like all that stuff. It's like exactly there. But like, it can be hard to hear like a real thing, like in that sense. And I love, with Justin too, that you gave both your wife and Charlie a read to kind of actually, yeah, but nobody else, and not Capote, because like it's kind of a punching down, punching up kind of question too. That is like Capote doesn't, you can't punch down on Capote. He is dead, but like either way, like, whereas people in your life who maybe aren't like writers and don't have their own books, and you want to have like a relationship with that's valuable, that's important.
Yeah, totally. And even like with dead people, because I think if you don't, you obviously don't have well, at least not the same relationship with them, but that's kind of the interesting, like where the rubber meets the road for me, where it's like, there's this assumption, I think, in a lot of like cultural narratives around the dead, that they don't deserve any of the same considerations that a living character does. And that was one of the things, Jana, that I like deeply admired about your book, is that like I don't see that very much. I don't see people really taking seriously the question of what does it mean to portray a dead person. Just because they're dead doesn't mean that your version becomes the authoritative one. And like there's all this interesting stuff in your book about like even like that. I loved the part, and I feel like it came pretty late, but don't quote me, where it's like it's about Takako's physical appearance, where people are describing her completely differently, like as a different person. And I found that deeply fascinating. I was like super glad you included it, because that kind of stuff, I don't think you see enough. You see this thing where people want to fix dead people, and they feel much more comfortable fixing them in what I think is usually a pretty flat portrayal and functional portrayal, where they serve a purpose in a narrative and not as like human beings. And I don't think you forfeit your humanity when you die. Like, I don't think you should. And so that was like, I thought a lot about Capote and like, am I doing the same thing to Capote because he's dead? But you're right. Like he still controls his narrative. He always did. He was like a myth maker about himself. And like, he's still at this point, I think also I knew that like the cultural narrative around Capote doesn't really even acknowledge what he did. And around In Cold Blood specifically, it really doesn't. It doesn't acknowledge the huge like lies he told. And I don't care about the lies. I don't. I know why he did it, but I want them acknowledged. I want it to be part of the conversation around, especially because of like all the influence he had. And everybody who does true crime imitates Capote, and especially in that particular way. And that was really one of my favorite parts of your book, Jana, was just like that ability and appreciation and like instinct to make Takako both like to never fix her into a portrayal, and in so doing to make her feel more human. Because if you talk to a real human being and you talk to 10 of their friends, you hear about 10 different people. And I just like really, really admired that part. And I totally agree with that underlying like idea that you have to give dead people that respect.
Well, that's one of the great little moments in one of the that you have, like this idea you have for how to portray her. Instead of casting one actress to portray her, you cast 10 actresses. And I'm like, oh shit, that is a great idea, because it draws attention to the artifice of it and to that projection that we're doing. And I love that was in the book, even as like an idea that you knew this was a good idea, couldn't figure out how to make the movie. But like then that kind of just sticks there. as a thing that's in our head the rest of the time, which is a beautiful, it's just like a beautiful move. It's like you had this idea, move on to something else, but it's still there in the constellation.
I move on to try and shoot snow falling from the ceiling of my apartment, and it unravels. I don't move on to a better idea, that's for sure.
I think this is probably a good endpoint because we're at about an hour for the time being, but we have a couple of questions in the chat and a few things I'm interested in talking about that I hope we can follow up over email about. And I had this idea. I was thinking about when I was transcribing one of these other salons that we did with Matthew Gavin Frank and Nicole Walker, which was also a really fun event. And you can find that embedded on the Essay Daily blog if you haven't taken a look at that. Hopefully we're going to publish that as like a conversation at some point. But I really wanted them to watch the new Nicolas Cage movie Pig, which I really loved and thought was interesting. But both Nicole and Matthew are kind of gourmands, and that movie has that aspect to it. And I feel like there should be like another kind of salon where we could watch Guy Madden's My Winnipeg and have the two of you be here to just to like talk about the movie. Don't talk about the books, just talk about like a third thing. That would be kind of fascinating. And so I don't know, maybe that's a thing that we should do at some point. We do have one question in the chat, which maybe is a good one in the last, so I've been working, it's from Katie. I don't know if you could read the chat or not. I'm kind of going to try to gloss it here. If there's like a better descriptor for something that is not true crime, because true crime does have a lot of baggage attached to it. This seems like a real practical question. I don't know if either of you have an idea, a question about this one.
I don't want to, sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll be short and then I'll hand it over to Jana. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the question of genre is always kind of like two questions, which is one of which is like, what do you call it? And then one of which is, what are the publishers going to call it? And so I think it is important to think about like, how do you think about it? How do you want to situate it? And I think the examples you give, I know The Third Rainbow Girl, I don't know, I'll check out the Appleman book. I mean, there is kind of like, I think a lot of Alex Marzano-Lesnovich's The Fact of a Body as an example of that, which is a book that just blew my doors off when I first read it. Like I felt like they were doing something that I had not seen. And it's called like a murder and a memoir, which is a very, very interesting genre distinction to make. But I mean, I do think there's a lot of range around like the way authors and artists are presenting these like true crime narratives, and especially ones in which they're implicated in various ways. But I also think the reality is that most of the time, by the time they hit a bookshelf, they're called true crime because true crime sells. And there's massive, massive audiences for true crime. It's really one of the most popular like commercial genres in all media right now. So that's like kind of what I do think there's a lot of sophisticated work being done around the genre, like by artists and complicating it. But I still think, I just read another book. It's a Sarabande book. It's called, oh, sorry. I blurbed it, but they changed the title. It's by Ashley Farmer. It was called Mercy, and I think they changed the title, but it's a great example of what I'm talking about. It's like a really just smart and humane and like and nuanced kind of look at it. But I'm curious to see like, what does that look like once it's shelved in your local bookstore? The odds are it's probably true crime.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for this. I feel like this is Justin's expertise. I like what Andrew just put in the chat. You can call it a thing and still disrupt the thing. That's a good play generally. I would agree with that.
I mean, just because it's called a thing doesn't mean, I mean, it just sets the terms of engagement, which then you can mess with in whatever way you want. I mean, I don't know, there's a lot of ways of adding things, like an additive thing rather than calling it something else. I can guarantee you, like, most big publishers won't want to call it an essay. Like, people don't generally like that. Small presses will, but I mean, it can be an essay either way. And I think anything, I don't know, I don't trust any book that's too comfortable with the genre of the thing that it's in. I just don't think that's good art. And it's not good for artists to be that. I'm glad we could answer a practical question here at the end. And this is a thing that I would also be happy to talk about a bit more. So if you have other questions for our guests, feel free to drop me an email. I'm ander@thediagram.com if you want to drop me a line, and I'm happy to pose them at a later date to perhaps be published as a conversation on the website. And thanks you all for coming. As particular thanks to Jana and to Justin for your generosity and your badassery and the great books and conversation. Like, really, I mean, really moving and interesting stuff that, like, both these books have meant a lot to me this year. And I hope that if you have not read them, you buy them and they'll mean a lot to you too. So thanks very much. We'll be doing another one of these probably in about a month and a half. You can just check back on the Essay Daily Twitter or essaydaily.org, and there'll be more info about that. And if you have other ideas for conversations you'd like to have, salons you'd like to have that other people aren't having, let us know. We're happy to do what we can to line up some true badasses to be here and answer your questions.